On a Thursday morning in November of 2023, construction workers demolishing the old Majestic Motor Lodge on the outskirts of Wickenburg, Arizona, made a discovery that would unravel one of the state's oldest missing person cases and shake the foundation of a community that had built its identity on trust and collective memory. The motel, abandoned since 1987, and scheduled for replacement with a strip mall, had been a landmark of decay for decades, its neon sign dark, its rooms boarded up, its parking lot cracked and overtaken by brittle bush and creosote. The crew had been working for 3 days, systematically tearing down the structure room by room, when a backhoe operator named Miguel Herrera noticed something unusual in the debris. As he cleared the remnants of what had been Room 7, his machine struck something that should not have been there. A concrete slab beneath the floorboards, much thicker and newer than the original foundation. Miguel stopped the machine and climbed down to investigate. The concrete was different from the rest, smoother, with a slightly different color that suggested it had been poured at a different time. He called over the foreman, Thomas Brightwater, a Yavapai man who had worked construction in the area for 30 years and knew the history of every building from Prescott to Phoenix. Thomas examined the slab and made a decision that would later be credited with preserving crucial evidence. Instead of breaking through it with heavy machinery, he called the Wickenburg Police Department and reported a suspicious structure that might warrant investigation. Detective Sergeant Rosa Delgado arrived within an hour, accompanied by Officer James Park. Delgado had been with the department for 15 years, long enough to know that construction sites occasionally uncovered remnants of the past. Old wells, forgotten basements, sometimes Native American artifacts that required careful handling. But something about the precision of this concrete slab, the way it had been deliberately placed and concealed, triggered her investigative instincts. She requested that the construction crew clear the area and called for a forensic team from the Maricopa County Sheriff's Office. By afternoon, the forensic team had set up a perimeter around Room 7, photographing every angle, documenting the layers of construction, the way the original floorboards had been carefully removed and replaced after the concrete was poured. They used ground-penetrating radar to examine what lay beneath, and the results made everyone stop breathing for a moment. There was a void in the concrete, an air pocket that suggested something had been encased within it, something that had decomposed over time, leaving a cavity, a shadow of what had once been solid. The decision to break through the concrete was made jointly by Detective Delgado and Lieutenant Marcus Webb from the County Sheriff's Office. They used precise tools, working slowly, carefully, aware that whatever lay beneath had been hidden for a reason and might be evidence in a crime that had gone undetected for years. As chunks of concrete were removed, the smell hit them first, not strong, not the overwhelming stench of recent death, but something musty and old, like opening a tomb that had been sealed for generations. And then they saw it. Fabric first, degraded but still recognizable as clothing. And within that fabric, bones. Human bones, arranged in a way that suggested the body had been placed deliberately, not thrown or dumped, but positioned with care that seemed at odds with the violence implied by the concealment. The medical examiner, Dr. Patricia Harsing, was called to the scene. She worked through the evening, using brushes and small tools to expose the remains without disturbing their position. The skeleton was largely intact, preserved by the dry Arizona climate and the protection of the concrete. It was clearly adult, and preliminary examination suggested male, though formal identification would require detailed analysis. But it was what Dr. Hassing found beside the body that transformed this from an anonymous crime into something specific and solvable: a wallet, leather, cracked with age, but still holding its contents. A driver's license from the state of Indiana. The photo faded, but the text still legible. William Bradley Thornton, born March 15, 1921, height 5'11", weight 175 pounds, hair brown, eyes blue. And tucked behind the license, a train ticket stub. One way from Chicago to Phoenix, dated May 8, 1948. Detective Delgado ran the name through every database available to modern law enforcement. William Thornton had been reported missing on May 14, 1948, 6 days after arriving in Phoenix. The missing person report, filed by his wife Margaret in Indianapolis, had been forwarded to Arizona authorities, but had generated no leads. The case had gone cold within months, a common occurrence in an era before computers, before DNA analysis, before the interconnected systems that now made it possible to track someone across state lines. William Thornton had simply vanished, becoming one of thousands of people who disappeared in post-war America, when mobility was increasing and communication was still limited to letters and telegrams. The original case file, retrieved from the Arizona State Archives, was thin but revealing. William Thornton had been 27 years old when he disappeared, a World War II veteran who had served in the Pacific Theater, earning a Bronze Star at Iwo Jima. After the war, he had returned to Indianapolis and married his sweetheart Margaret, taking a job at an insurance company and settling into what appeared to be a normal civilian life. But according to the missing person report, he had become increasingly restless in the months before his disappearance, talking about opportunities in the West, about starting over in a place where nobody knew him, where the war didn't hang over every conversation. Margaret had opposed the trip, but William had insisted it was just a vacation, a chance to see the country he had fought to defend. He had promised to be gone no more than 2 weeks. The last confirmed sighting of William Thornton had been at the Phoenix train station on May 8th, where a porter remembered helping him with his luggage and directing him to a taxi. After that, nothing. Margaret had received one postcard, postmarked May 10th, from Wickenburg, showing a scene of the Hassayampa River with a brief message: "Beautiful country out here. You'd love it. We'll write more soon. Love, Bill." She never heard from him again. Detective Delgado assembled a task force to investigate not just the murder of William Thornton, for murder it surely was, but also the circumstances that had kept it hidden for 75 years. The first step was identifying who had owned the Majestic Motor Lodge in 1948. Property records showed that the motel had been built in 1946 by a man named Harold Jasper, a Phoenix businessman who had seen opportunity in the post-war boom of automobile tourism. Jasper had operated the motel until his death in 1978, after which his son Donald had taken over, running it with declining success until finally abandoning it in 1987. Donald Jasper was still alive, 81 years old, living in a retirement community in Scottsdale. When Detective Delgado and Lieutenant Webb arrived to interview him, they found a man who seemed to have been waiting for this visit for most of his life. He sat in his small apartment, surrounded by photographs of the motel in its heyday, And before they could ask their first question, he said, "You found something at the motel, didn't you? In room 7? The detectives exchanged glances. Delgado asked how he knew it was room 7, and Donald's answer sent the investigation in a direction no one had anticipated. He said his father had never rented out room 7 after the summer of 1948, had claimed it was unlucky, had problems with the plumbing, had various excuses that changed over the years. But Donald had always suspected there was more to it. His father had been a different man after that summer, drinking heavily, prone to dark moods, jumping at unexpected sounds. And on his deathbed in 1978, Harold Jasper had grabbed his son's hand and said something that Donald had never understood until now. "I protected this family. Remember that. Whatever happens, I protected us." Donald provided the detectives with a box of his father's papers that he had saved, not sure why, just feeling they might be important someday. Among them were ledgers from the motel's early years, guest registers that showed who had stayed in which room and when. The entry for May 10, 1948, showed room 7 occupied by W. Thornton, Indianapolis. The next entry for that room was crossed out, and after that, the room number never appeared again in any register. But it was another name in the register that caught Delgado's attention. Room 8, the room adjacent to room 7, had been occupied from May 9, 15, 1948 by someone named Catherine Moss from Los Angeles. The handwriting was different from the other entries, more elegant, more careful, and there was a note in the margin in Harold Jasper's hand. "Paid cash, no questions." The investigation into Catherine Moss revealed a ghost. No one by that name had lived in Los Angeles in 1948. No records of her existed before or after those 6 days in May. But Detective Delgado, working with a forensic document examiner, discovered something crucial. The handwriting of Catherine Moss in the register matched another signature in Harold Jasper's papers on a receipt for construction materials purchased on May 15, 1948, including several bags of concrete mix. The signature was from Martha Jasper, Harold's wife. Martha Jasper had died in 1963, reportedly of a heart attack, though her death certificate, when Delgado pulled it, showed she had actually died from an overdose of barbiturates, ruled accidental by the coroner. Harold had found her body in room 7 of the motel, the room that had been sealed since that summer 15 years earlier. She had left no note, but Donald remembered his mother's final years as ones of deep depression and anxiety, punctuated by periods where she would stare at nothing and whisper apologies to someone who wasn't there. The forensic team expanded their search of the motel grounds, using ground-penetrating radar to examine the entire foundation. They found no other bodies, but they did discover something else in what had been the motel's storage building. Buried beneath decades of accumulated junk was a steamer trunk, locked and covered in dust. Inside were men's clothes, the style consistent with late 1940s fashion, a shaving kit with the initials WBT embossed on the leather, and a journal, its pages yellow and brittle, but still readable. The journal belonged to William Thornton, and its entries painted a picture of a man struggling with what would now be recognized as severe PTSD. He wrote about nightmares of combat, of inability to connect with his wife, of feeling like a stranger in his own life. The trip west was meant to be a chance to find himself again, to reconnect with the person he had been before the war. The early entries, written on the train from Chicago, were hopeful, even optimistic. He described the changing landscape, the sense of possibility, the relief of being anonymous. The entry for May 9th described his arrival in Wickenburg, which he had chosen because someone on the train had mentioned it as a quiet town with good weather and cheap lodging. He wrote about checking into the majestic motor lodge, about the friendly owner, Harold, and his beautiful wife, Martha, who had brought him lemonade and asked about his travels. The entry for May 10th was the last, and it was different in tone, confused and fearful. He wrote, "Something's wrong here. Heard arguing last night through the wall. Mrs. Jasper was crying. This morning she knocked at my door, looking scared, asking if she could come in. I said no, but she kept insisting, saying she needed help. Then Harold appeared and pulled her away. The way he looked at me. I'm checking out today." He never got the chance. The investigation turned to Harold Jasper's background, and what emerged was a pattern of violence and control that had been hidden beneath a veneer of small-town respectability. Harold had been arrested twice in Phoenix in the early 1940s for assault, charges that were dropped both times when witnesses refused to testify. A woman who had worked as a maid at the motel in 1947 was tracked down in California, now 95 years old, but still sharp. She remembered Martha Jasper as a woman who was terrified of her husband, who wore long sleeves, even in summer, to hide bruises, who sometimes begged the staff not to leave her alone with Harold when he was drinking. The maid, Dolores Vega, remembered something else. In early May of 1948, Martha had confided in her that she was planning to leave Harold, that she had met someone who was going to help her escape. She didn't say who, but she seemed hopeful for the first time in years. Then suddenly, around May 15th, Martha changed. She fired Dolores without explanation, became withdrawn and silent, and never smiled again. Dolores had always wondered what happened to crush Martha's spirits so completely. Now she knew. Detective Delgado constructed a timeline of events based on the evidence. William Thornton had arrived at the motel on May 10th, a vulnerable man seeking solitude. Martha Jasper, desperate to escape her abusive marriage, had seen in him a possible savior, someone who might help her leave. Whether there had been an actual connection between them, or Martha had simply projected her hopes onto this stranger, something had happened on the night of May 10th that had ended with William Thornton dead and Martha complicit in covering up the crime. The forensic analysis of Thornton's remains revealed the cause of death: blunt force trauma to the skull, consistent with being struck repeatedly with a heavy object. The pattern of injuries suggested he had been attacked from behind, likely by surprise. Dr. Hashing noted that the positioning of the body in the concrete suggested it had been placed there with some care, arms folded across the chest, legs straight, almost as if someone had tried to give him dignity, even in death. But who had struck the fatal blows? Harold Jasper seemed the obvious suspect, a violent man who had discovered his wife's plan to leave, who had killed the man he saw as her accomplice. But as Delgado dug deeper into the evidence, she found suggestions of a more complex truth. The construction materials receipt signed by Martha, the fact that she had registered as Catherine Moss in room 8, the careful positioning of the body, all suggested that Martha had been more than just an accessory after the fact. Donald Jasper, when presented with this theory, revealed something he had never told anyone. When his mother was dying from the overdose in 1963, before she lost consciousness, she had grabbed his hand and said, I killed him, not Harold. Me. I killed that poor man because I was too much of a coward to kill the one who deserved it. Donald had thought she was delirious, rambling, but she had kept repeating it. Room 7. I'm sorry, room 7. The truth, as Delgado reconstructed it, was more tragic than anyone had imagined. Martha Jasper, desperate to escape her abusive marriage, had indeed approached William Thornton for help. But when Harold discovered their conversation, he had threatened to kill them both. In a moment of desperate self-preservation, Martha had made a terrible choice. She had lured Thornton to room 7, perhaps promising to meet him there with money or information, and then, while he was distracted, she had struck him with something heavy, probably a lamp or a piece of furniture. She had killed an innocent man to save herself from her husband's wrath, and then had helped Harold bury the evidence beneath concrete, sealing away both the body and her last hope of escape. The community of Wickenburg reacted to these revelations with shock and disbelief. The Jasper family had been pillars of the town for decades. Harold had served on the city council, had donated to local charities, had been seen as a successful businessman who had helped put Wickenburg on the map as a tourist destination. The idea that he had been a violent abuser who had orchestrated a murder and cover-up challenged everything the older residents thought they knew about their town's history. But others, particularly women who had known Martha Jasper, were not surprised. They came forward with stories they had kept to themselves for decades, stories of seeing Martha with black eyes explained away as accidents, of hearing Harold's rages through the thin walls of the motel, of Martha's gradual transformation from a vivacious young woman to a hollow ghost who barely spoke above a whisper. They had suspected something was deeply wrong, but hadn't known how to help, in an era when domestic violence was considered a private matter. The question of prosecution hung over the investigation. Harold Jasper had been dead for 45 years, Martha for 60. There was no one left to charge with William Thornton's murder. But Detective Delgado felt an obligation to complete the investigation, to give William Thornton's story the ending it deserved. She tracked down his surviving family, finding a nephew in Indianapolis who had grown up hearing stories about his Uncle Bill, who had disappeared out west. The nephew, Robert Thornton, now 78 years old, traveled to Arizona to claim his uncle's remains. The forensic team made one more discovery that added a final piece to the puzzle. In William Thornton's wallet, behind his driver's license and train ticket, was a small photograph of a woman in a nurse's uniform. On the back was Zeus written Martha, 1944. Research revealed that Martha Jasper had served as a nurse in San Diego during the war, at the same hospital where William Thornton had been treated for wounds received at Iwo Jima. They had known each other before, had likely been friends, possibly more. William's trip to Arizona might not have been as random as it seemed. He might have been coming to see Martha, not knowing she was now married to Harold Jasper, not knowing he was walking into a nightmare that would cost him his life. This revelation cast Martha's actions in a different light. She had not killed a stranger to save herself. She had killed someone she had once cared for, someone who had come to Arizona possibly to find her. The weight of that betrayal, that desperate, terrible choice, had haunted her for the rest of her life, until she finally took her own life in the same room where she had taken his. The majestic motor lodge was demolished completely after the investigation concluded. The ground where Room 7 had stood was excavated down to undisturbed earth, ensuring no trace of the tragedy remained. The site is now a shopping center, anchored by a chain pharmacy and a fast food restaurant, indistinguishable from thousands of similar developments across the Southwest. But the Wickenburg Historical Society installed a small plaque near the road, not mentioning the murder, but commemorating William Bradley Thornton, veteran and traveler, who had come to Arizona seeking peace, and had found instead an ending he never could have imagined. Detective Delgado, reflecting on the case months later, said that what struck her most was not the violence of the crime or the elaborateness of the cover-up, but the layers of tragedy that had created the conditions for it to happen. A war veteran struggling with trauma, a woman trapped in an abusive marriage, a violent man whose reputation protected him from consequences, and a society that looked away from domestic violence. William Thornton's death was not just a murder, but a convergence of multiple failures, personal and societal, that had created a perfect storm of desperation and violence. The case files were officially closed in March of 2024, with the cause of William Thornton's death listed as homicide and the perpetrators identified as Harold and Martha Jasper, both deceased. But for the community of Wickenburg, the case remained open in a different sense, forcing a reckoning with the past and the stories they had told themselves about who they were and where they came from. Margaret Thornton had died in 1962, never knowing what had happened to her husband, going to her grave believing he had abandoned her for a new life in the West. Her children had grown up without a father, creating their own narratives about why he had left. Robert Thornton, the nephew, said that finally knowing the truth, as horrible as it was better than the decades of uncertainty. His uncle had not abandoned his family. He had been murdered, and while justice in the traditional sense was no longer possible, there was something valuable in having the truth finally revealed. In the Arizona State Archives, historians discovered more documents related to the case, including correspondence between Arizona and Indiana law enforcement from 1948. The letters showed that authorities had made genuine efforts to find William Thornton, but without the tools and technologies available today, they had been unable to penetrate the Jaspers' deception. One detective had even stayed at the Majestic Motor Lodge during his investigation, possibly sleeping just yards from where Thornton's body lay buried, never suspecting the truth beneath his feet. The discovery also prompted a review of other cold cases from the same era, with investigators wondering how many other disappearances might be hidden beneath the foundations of old buildings. How many other victims might be waiting to be found. 3 other properties in Wickenburg dating from the 1940s were scanned with ground-penetrating radar, though no additional bodies were discovered. Dr. Hashing, the medical examiner, published a paper on the case in a forensic science journal, focusing on how the Arizona climate and the concrete encasement had preserved the remains and evidence in a way that made identification possible after 75 years. She noted that without the wallet and its contents, identification would have been much more difficult, as DNA comparison would have required finding living relatives and hoping for a match. The case attracted national attention, with true crime podcasts and documentary producers reaching out to Detective Delgado for interviews. She declined most of them, feeling that sensationalizing the tragedy would dishonor both William Thornton and, in a complicated way, Martha Jasper, who had been both perpetrator and victim. The story, she felt, was not entertainment, but a cautionary tale about the dangers of silence, of looking away from abuse, of the ripple effects of violence that could span generations. Donald Jasper struggled with the revelations about his parents. He had spent his life defending his father's memory, dismissing the rumors and whispers as small-town gossip. To learn that his father had been worse than the rumors suggested, and that his mother had been driven to murder, shattered his understanding of his own history. He underwent therapy to process the trauma of these discoveries, eventually writing a memoir about growing up in the shadow of violence he had been trained not to see. The memoir, published in late 2024, became an unexpected bestseller, not because of the sensational crime, but because of Donald's honest exploration of how family secrets and societal blindness to domestic violence had shaped his life. He donated the proceeds to domestic violence shelters in Arizona, saying it was the only way he could think of to make some small amends for his father's actions and his own years of denial. Local historians in Wickenburg began collecting oral histories from people who had known the Jaspers, trying to construct a more complete picture of life in the town during the 1940s and 1950s. What emerged was a complex portrait of a community struggling with rapid change, as the old frontier town transformed into a tourist destination, bringing new people and new problems that the traditional social structures were not equipped to handle. Several women who had worked at the Majestic Motor Lodge over the years came forward with their own stories of Harold Jasper's inappropriate behavior, advances they had fended off, threats they had endured. None had reported these incidents at the time, knowing that Harold's standing in the community meant they would not be believed. Their stories added another layer to the understanding of how Harold had operated with impunity for so many years. The Wickenburg Police Department instituted new training protocols based on the case, emphasizing the importance of taking domestic violence seriously and recognizing the signs of coercive control. Detective Delgado became a frequent speaker at law enforcement conferences, using the Thornton case to illustrate how crimes could be hidden in plain sight when society chose not to see certain types of violence. As the first anniversary of the discovery approached, Robert Thornton returned to Arizona for a memorial service. He had arranged for his uncle's remains to be cremated and had brought the ashes to scatter in the desert outside Wickenburg, not at the site of his death, but in the open country he had written about so enthusiastically in his journal before everything went wrong. The service was small, attended by Detective Delgado, a few local officials, and, surprisingly, Donald Jasper, who came to apologize on behalf of his family. Robert Thornton accepted the apology with grace, saying that while nothing could undo what had happened, he appreciated the gesture and understood that Donald was not responsible for his parents' actions. As Robert scattered the ashes in the desert wind, he read from his uncle's journal the optimistic entry written on the train journey west about new beginnings and the promise of open spaces. It was a reminder of who William Thornton had been before that night in room 7, a man full of hope despite his struggles, looking for healing in the American West that had called to so many before and after him. The spot where the Majestic Motor Lodge had stood is now completely transformed. The shopping center bustles with activity, families getting prescriptions filled, teenagers hanging out in the parking lot, travelers stopping for fast food on their way through town. Most people who shop there have no idea what lies beneath the asphalt and concrete. What tragedy had unfolded on that ground 75 years ago? But Detective Delgado sometimes drives by and thinks about all the secrets that might be buried beneath the ordinary surfaces of everyday life. All the victims who never got justice. All the perpetrators who died with their crimes undiscovered. The Thornton case had been solved by pure chance, by a backhoe operator noticing something unusual. How many other cases would never have that moment of revelation? She keeps William Thornton's photograph in her desk drawer, not as a trophy, but as a reminder. It shows him in his military uniform, young and serious, unaware of what awaited him. Below it, she keeps Martha Jasper's nursing photograph, the one found in Thornton's wallet. Martha is smiling in it, also young, also unaware of what she would become, what she would be driven to do. The case changed how Delgado approached her work. She began looking more carefully at missing person cases, especially old ones, wondering what secrets might be hidden, not in remote wilderness, but in plain sight, beneath buildings, behind walls, in the spaces people pass by every day without suspecting the history they contain. She pushed for more resources for cold case investigations, arguing that every missing person deserved the same effort to find them, whether they disappeared yesterday or decades ago. The Wickenburg Historical Society created an exhibit about the case, not sensationalizing it, but using it to explore broader themes about post-war America, domestic violence, and the evolution of law enforcement. They included information about resources for domestic violence victims, making the exhibit not just about the past, but about preventing similar tragedies in the present. Donald Jasper donated his father's papers to the Historical Society, including the guest registers from the motel. Researchers studying them found patterns suggesting that the Majestic Motor Lodge had been a refuge for other women fleeing abusive situations, women whom Martha had quietly helped with free rooms and meals, even while trapped in her own nightmare. This discovery added yet another layer of complexity to Martha's story, showing her as someone who had tried to help others even when she couldn't help herself. The case also prompted changes in how construction and demolition projects were handled in Wickenburg. New protocols required that any unusual findings during demolition be reported immediately to authorities, and workers were trained to recognize potential archaeological or forensic sites. While some complained about the additional regulations, others recognized them as necessary to ensure that hidden histories could be uncovered and addressed. As Detective Delgado prepared her final report on the case, she struggled with how to summarize something so complex, so layered with different types of tragedy. In the end, she wrote simply that William Bradley Thornton had been murdered on or about May 10, 1948, by Martha Jasper, acting under duress from her husband, Harold Jasper, and that his body had been concealed in the foundation of the Majestic Motor Lodge, where it remained, undiscovered for 75 years, until found by construction workers on November 16, 2023. But those facts, while true, felt inadequate to capture the full story. They didn't convey William's hope as he traveled west, or Martha's desperation as she tried to escape her marriage, or Harold's reign of terror that had created the conditions for murder. They didn't explain how a community could look away from obvious abuse, or how a woman could be driven to kill someone she had once cared for, or how a secret could be kept for decades until chance finally brought it to light. The story of William Thornton's murder was, Delgado realized, not just a crime to be solved, but a mirror held up to the past, reflecting all the ways that society's failures to protect the vulnerable could compound into tragedy. It was a reminder that justice delayed was not always justice denied, that sometimes the truth could still matter, even when everyone involved was long dead. That bearing witness to past wrongs was itself a form of honoring the victims. A year after the discovery, on a quiet Sunday morning, Detective Delgado returned to the site alone. The shopping center was closed, the parking lot empty except for her car. She stood where room 7 would have been, now covered by asphalt and drainage grates, and thought about William Thornton's last night, about Martha Jasper's desperate choice, about Harold Jasper's violence that had poisoned everything it touched. She thought, too, about her own work, about the cases that might never be solved, the victims who might never be found. But the Thornton case had taught her that sometimes, against all odds, the truth did surface. Sometimes the past refused to stay buried. Sometimes a construction worker noticed something unusual, and a 75-year-old mystery was finally solved, bringing closure to a family and forcing a community to confront its history. As she drove away, Delgado made a mental note to review other cold cases from the 1940s and 1950s to look for patterns that might have been missed, connections that might lead to other hidden truths. William Thornton had waited 75 years to be found. How many others were still waiting? The sun was rising over the desert, painting the mountains in shades of gold and pink. It was the same sun that had risen on May 10, 1948, the day William Thornton died, the same desert that had witnessed countless tragedies and triumphs over millennia. The landscape endured, indifferent to human drama, keeping its secrets until someone bothered to look, to dig, to ask the right questions. The case of William Bradley Thornton was closed, officially and finally. But its echoes would continue, in the training of new detectives, in the memories of those who had worked to solve it, in the knowledge that beneath the ordinary surfaces of everyday life, extraordinary secrets might be waiting to be discovered. Justice might be delayed. But as long as there were people willing to search for the truth, it need not be lost forever. In the end, William Thornton got what he had been denied for 75 years: recognition, identity, a story that explained his absence. He had not abandoned his family. He had not started a new life under a new name. He had been murdered, and while his killers had escaped earthly justice, their crime had not gone unwitnessed forever. The truth, once uncovered, could not be buried again.